Jamal West, a black man, finds himself unjustly stopped and arrested by two racist police officers, Carter and Barnes. Yet, as the events unfold, his true identity is revealed, leaving the entire station utterly stunned. Who exactly is Jamal West? And why did his mere existence send shockwaves through the police department? Stay tuned to uncover this shocking story. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, hit that subscribe button. The morning sun was beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting long shadows on the streets below. The sounds of traffic, distant sirens, and the hum of early city life created a familiar buzz. People hurried along, heading to work, grabbing coffee and walking their pets. In the midst of this hustle, Jamal West strolled through, his calm demeanor contrasting with the hurried pace around him. Jamal was in his mid-30s, dressed in a sleek, custom-fitted suit. His shoes tapped rhythmically on the pavement as he moved down the street. A soft smile on his face, he adjusted his cufflinks. He carried himself with a natural confidence, not attention-seeking, but noticeable nonetheless. He had just finished breakfast at his favorite local spot, where the staff knew him by name and always served his favorite: scrambled eggs, turkey sausage, and a side of fresh fruit. As he neared his car, a polished black sedan parked on the curb, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Glancing down, he saw a text from his mom reminding him about dinner that evening. Smiling, he quickly replied, assuring her he hadn't forgotten. Family was everything to him, and he was looking forward to it. Just then, Jamal noticed two officers approaching him with intent. Their eyes were locked on him, faces stony and unreadable. Jamal didn't know them, but with the police rotating often, that wasn't unusual. What stood out, though, was the intensity in their stares. Growing up, Jamal had been taught how to handle police encounters as a black man. His father had drilled into him the importance of staying calm, respectful, and never giving them a reason to escalate. Those lessons had stuck with him. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out, stepping closer. Jamal paused and turned to face them, his phone still in hand. "Yes, officer," he responded, his voice composed and polite. He glanced at the officer's name tag, Carter. The other officer, Barnes, stood a bit behind, his hand resting conspicuously close to his holster. "Mind if we see some ID?" Carter demanded, his tone sharp, almost curt. There was no greeting, no explanation for the sudden request. Jamal had been through this routine before, but something about this felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that set his instincts on edge. "May I ask why?" Jamal replied, keeping his tone calm. He didn't want any trouble, but he knew his rights. He hadn't done anything to warrant this kind of attention. Carter's eyes narrowed, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Just show us some ID, sir. It's not a big deal." Jamal maintained eye contact, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. "Sure," he said, pulling out his wallet, "but I'd still like to know what this is about." As he handed over his license, he noticed Barnes shifting slightly, as though bracing for something. Jamal's senses sharpened, though he stayed outwardly calm. Carter examined the ID, his expression unmoving. "What's your business in this neighborhood?" Carter asked, his tone edging on accusation. Jamal's brow creased in slight confusion. "I'm just heading to my car," he responded honestly. "Is there a problem?" Carter ignored the question. "Where are you coming from?" "I just finished breakfast at the diner up the block," Jamal answered evenly. "Is there something wrong, officer?" Carter's gaze flicked back to Jamal's face, a faint glint of something, maybe irritation, crossing his expression before he returned the ID. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Carter said with a smirk. "You fit the description." Jamal's stomach nodded. He knew this narrative too well. A black man in a good neighborhood, dressed sharply, must be suspicious. He'd heard it all before, but that didn't make it any easier. "I understand," Jamal said carefully, "but I'm just here to get to my car and head to work." Carter didn't seem to care. Instead, he stepped closer, his posture more confrontational. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm an attorney," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "I have a meeting in an hour, so if there's no issue, I'd like to be on my way." That answer seemed to catch Carter off guard. The smirk faded, if only briefly. "A lawyer? Huh? Interesting." Barnes, who had stayed silent up until this point, finally spoke up. "You hiding anything in that car of yours? Anything illegal?" Jamal could feel the tension building fast. He knew just how bad situations like this could get if he wasn't careful. Keeping his voice steady, he replied, "No, officer, there's nothing illegal in my car." You're welcome to check, but honestly, I'd prefer if you didn't waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work. Carter's gaze sharpened. You don't get to tell us how to do our job. Step away from the car. Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he could see this wasn't going in a good direction. It was either comply and hope they didn't take it further, or stand his ground and risk escalating things. In his mind, he heard his father's voice reminding him to stay calm and think smart. Taking a deep breath, Jamal said, "All right." He raised his hand slowly to show he wasn't a threat. "I'll step back." He moved a few steps away from the car, watching as Carter advanced, his hand hovering over his baton. Jamal's heart was racing, but he kept his face calm. He couldn't let them see any fear. Suddenly, without warning, Carter grabbed Jamal's arm, twisting it behind his back. The unexpected force made Jamal wince in pain. Before he could react, Barnes joined in, forcing him down to the ground. "Hey, what's going on?" Jamal managed to say, trying to keep his voice steady despite the pain shooting through his shoulder. He wasn't resisting, but they were treating him like he was. "You're under arrest for resisting," Carter said coldly, tightening the cuffs around Jamal's wrists. Jamal's mind reeled. Resisting? He hadn't resisted anything. He had followed every instruction, stayed calm, tried to reason with them. But it didn't matter, they decided he was guilty the moment they saw him. By now, the scuffle had attracted the attention of nearby onlookers. Mrs. Agnes Carter, an elderly woman from across the street, watched from her balcony with horror. She knew Jamal from the neighborhood, had seen him around plenty of times, and knew he wasn't a troublemaker. "What are you doing to him?" she called out, her voice shaking with anger. "He hasn't done anything wrong." A young couple out walking their dog stopped to watch, and the man took out his phone, hitting record. "This is messed up," he muttered, turning to his girlfriend. "They're arresting him for nothing." Jamal caught sight of the phone recording, and a spark of hope flickered inside him. Maybe this footage would help later, maybe it would tell the real story. But right now, he was trapped in the moment. The officers yanked Jamal to his feet, and he forced himself to stay calm, thinking carefully about his next move. One wrong word, one wrong look, and it could all get worse. As they led him toward the squad car, the crowd around them grew. More people had stopped to watch, many of them pulling out phones, some shouting their disapproval. "This isn't right." A man shouted from across the street. "He didn't do anything." But Carter and Barnes ignored them, their faces set in determination. They pushed Jamal into the back of the squad car, slamming the door behind him. As the car started moving, Jamal turned his head to look out the window, catching the worried, angry expressions of the onlookers. He took a steadying breath and raised his voice just enough to be heard. "This isn't over," he said, his words echoing through the car. "This isn't over." His words hung in the air as they drove away, leaving the crowd behind. Inside the squad car, Jamal's mind spun with thoughts of what would come next. He was already preparing himself for the fight ahead. He knew he had to see this through and make sure justice was done. The police station was a harsh contrast to the lively streets outside. Cold gray walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and a steady hum of activity created an impersonal atmosphere. Officers moved briskly through the halls, some talking in low voices, others focused on their tasks. The station was busy, but there was a tension that hung in the air, the kind that made people glance over their shoulders and speak in hushed tones. Jamal West was escorted through the station doors, his hands still cuffed behind his back. Officer Carter and Officer Barnes flanked him, their faces unreadable. As they walked him through the booking area, a few officers glanced up, eyebrows raising slightly as they took in Jamal's appearance, a well-dressed black man, calm and composed, even in a situation like this. He definitely didn't look like the usual suspects they brought in. "Over here," Carter barked, guiding Jamal toward a desk where a weary officer sat behind a computer. The officer looked up, his expression indifferent, then glanced back down at the screen as though Jamal was just another case. "Name?" the officer asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "Jamal West," Carter replied before Jamal could speak. The officer typed the name into the system, his eyes scanning the screen. He frowned slightly, but didn't say anything. Instead, he motioned for Carter to bring Jamal over to the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this over with," Carter muttered, pushing Jamal forward. Jamal didn't resist. He knew better than to give them any reason to make things worse. As they took his fingerprints, he remained silent, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. But he knew he had to stay calm, had to think clearly. This wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of situation. And it likely wouldn't be the last. Once the fingerprinting was done, Carter and Barnes led Jamal to a small holding cell at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a narrow bench along one wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something sour and unpleasant. They uncuffed him and shoved him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Barnes sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here for a while." Jamal sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. He didn't respond to the taunts. There was no point. He knew they were trying to provoke him, trying to get a reaction, but he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. As Carter and Barnes walked away, they exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had done their job, brought in another troublemaker, and now they could move on to whatever came next. But something about this arrest gnawed at Carter, something that made him uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. But the way Jamal had handled himself, the calmness, the confidence didn't fit the profile of someone they usually picked up. "They think he's a lawyer or something." Barnes scoffed as they walked back to the front desk. "Probably just another punk with a fancy suit." Carter muttered, though his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't so sure anymore. Something about Jamal was off, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. It didn't matter. They had their orders and they had followed them. That was all there was to it. As they reached the desk, a young officer who had been quietly observing the scene stepped forward. His name was Officer Stevens, and he had been with the department for only a few months. He was eager to prove himself, to show that he could handle the job, but he was also smart, smarter than most gave him credit for. "Hey, Carter," Stevens called out, his voice low. Carter glanced at him, frowning. "What is it?" Stevens hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "That guy you just brought in, Jamal West, I think I know who he is." Carter's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" Stevens leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "I saw him in a news article a few weeks ago. He's not just a lawyer. He's a civil rights attorney. A pretty big deal, too. He's been involved in some major cases, high-profile stuff." Carter's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Stevens replied. "I didn't recognize him at first, but when I heard the name, it clicked. You might want to be careful with this one. If he's who I think he is, this could blow up in our faces." Carter didn't respond immediately. He felt a knot form in his stomach, but he pushed it down. This couldn't be true. They had arrested him fair and square. There was no way he could be someone important. But the doubt was there now, nagging at him. "I'll handle it," Carter said curtly, dismissing Stevens with a wave of his hand. But as he turned away, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Stevens watched Carter walk off, then pulled out his phone. He quickly scrolled through his contacts, finding the number he needed. With a deep breath, he dialed, praying he was making the right decision. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, Captain, it's Stevens," he said, keeping his voice low. "We have a situation here at the station. I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, back in the holding cell, Jamal sat quietly, his thoughts focused. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger. He had been targeted at that, he was certain, but he didn't know why. As he waited, he kept his composure, refusing to let fear take over. He had been through worse, and he knew he would get through this too. An hour passed before anything happened. The door to the holding area swung open, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority that made everyone take notice. Her name was Lieutenant Kate Thompson, recently transferred from another precinct. She was still getting to know the team, but she had already made it clear she was not someone to be underestimated. Thompson's gaze swept over the room, observing the officers as they went about their tasks. She spotted Carter and Barnes at the front desk, talking quietly among themselves. Something about their demeanor caught her attention. "Carter, Barnes," she called out, striding toward them. What's going on here? Carter looked up surprised. Nothing much, Mom. Just another day. Thompson's eyes narrowed. Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning. A man named Jamal West. Carter stiffened but quickly masked it. Yes, Mom, we did. And what was the charge? She asked, her tone probing. Resisting arrest, Carter replied, steadying his voice. We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Did he now? Carter nodded. Yes, Mom. Thompson didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied Carter's face, searching for any hint of deception. She had dealt with officers like him before. Those who thought they could bend the rules when it suited them. But she was different. She had risen through the ranks by following the book and expected her team to do the same. Take me to him, she said, leaving no room for argument. Carter hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. Right this way, Mom. As they walked toward the holding cells, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling there was more to the situation than Carter was letting on. When they reached Jamal's cell, she stopped, her gaze falling on the man inside. He was sitting on the bench, hands folded in his lap, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. There was a calmness about him that made her pause. This is him, she asked, turning to Carter. Yes, Mom, Carter confirmed. Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in. Thompson opened the cell door and stepped inside. Jamal looked up, meeting her gaze with steady eyes. He didn't seem intimidated or defiant, just composed. Mr. West, Thompson began, her voice even. I'm Lieutenant Thompson. I'm here to ask you a few questions. Of course, Lieutenant, Jamal replied politely. I'm happy to cooperate. Thompson nodded, appreciating his calm demeanor. I've been told that you resisted arrest, which led to your being brought in. I'd like to hear your side of the story. Jamal kept his gaze steady. Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every instruction given by officers Carter and Barnes. I was simply walking to my car when they stopped me. When I asked why I was being detained, that question seemed to escalate things. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting despite following their orders. Thompson listened carefully, her eyes narrowing as she processed Jamal's words. There was something about his calmness and clarity that suggested he wasn't just another man trying to talk his way out of trouble. She turned to Carter, who was standing behind her, trying to maintain a neutral expression. Is that true, Carter? Thompson asked sharply. Did Mr. West comply with your instructions? Carter shifted uncomfortably. Well, ma'am, he questioned us and things got tense. We had reason to believe he might be hiding something. Thompson's gaze hardened. And what exactly was that reason? Carter hesitated, struggling to come up with a convincing answer. It was just a gut feeling, Mom, a gut feeling. Thompson repeated incredulously. Is that the basis for your arrest now? Before Carter could respond, the holding area door swung open again. All eyes turned as Officer Stevens entered, looking slightly out of breath. He paused, realizing he had walked into a tense situation. Lieutenant, I need to speak with you, Stevens said urgently, glancing between Jamal and Carter. Thompson gave Carter a final hard look before stepping out of the cell and closing the door behind her. What is it, Stevens? Stevens lowered his voice, clearly trying to keep the conversation private. Mom, I've been doing some digging. Jamal West isn't just any lawyer. The door to the holding area swung open and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 30s with sharp eyes and an air of authority that made everyone take notice. Her name was Lieutenant Kate Thompson, and she was new to the station, having transferred from another precinct just a few weeks earlier. She was still getting to know the team, but she had already made it clear that she was not someone to be underestimated. Thompson's gaze swept over the room, taking in the officers going about their business. She spotted Carter and Barnes at the front desk, talking quietly among themselves. Something about their demeanor caught her attention. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that something was off. Carter, Barnes, she called out, walking over to them. What's going on here? Carter looked up, surprised to see her. Nothing much, Mom. Just another day. Thompson's eyes narrowed. Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning. A man named Jamal West. Carter stiffened slightly, but he quickly recovered. Yes, Mom. We did. And what was the charge? she asked, her tone calm but probing. Resisting arrest, Carter replied, his voice steady. We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Did he now? Carter nodded. Yes, Mom. Thompson didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Carter's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. She had dealt with officers like him before, men who thought they could bend the rules as long as it suited them. But she was different. She had come up through the ranks by doing things by the book, and she expected her team to do the same. Take me to him, she said finally, her voice leaving no room for argument. Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Right this way, Mom. As they walked toward the holding cells, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Carter was letting on. When they reached Jamal's cell, she stopped, her gaze locking onto the man inside. He was sitting on the bench, his hands folded in his lap, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. There was something about him, something that made her pause. This is him, she asked, turning to Carter. Yes, Mom, Carter confirmed. Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in. Thompson didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened the cell door and stepped inside. Jamal looked up, meeting her gaze with steady eyes. He didn't seem intimidated, but he also didn't seem defiant. He was just composed. Mr. West, Thompson said. Her voice measured. I'm Lieutenant Kate Thompson. I'm here to ask you a few questions. Of course, Lieutenant, Jamal replied politely. I'm happy to cooperate. Thompson nodded, appreciating Jamal's calm demeanor. I've been told that you resisted arrest, which led to your being brought in. I'd like to hear your side of the story. Jamal kept his gaze steady. Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every instruction given to me by Officers Carter and Barnes. I was walking to my car when they stopped me. I asked them why I was being detained, and that simple question seemed to escalate the situation. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting arrest despite following their orders. Thompson listened carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed Jamal's words. There was something about his tone, calm, measured, but with an underlying firmness that suggested he wasn't just another man trying to talk his way out of trouble. She turned to Carter, who was standing a few feet behind her, his expression carefully neutral. Is that true, Carter? Thompson asked, her voice sharp. Did Mr. West comply with your instructions? Carter shifted uncomfortably. Well, ma'am, he questioned us and things got tense. We had reason to believe he might be hiding something. Thompson's gaze hardened. And what exactly was that reason? Carter hesitated, unable to come up with a convincing response. It was just a gut feeling, ma'am, a gut feeling. Thompson repeated, her tone incredulous. Is that the basis for your arrest now? Carter opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the sound of the holding area door opening again. All eyes turned as Officer Stevens entered, looking slightly out of breath. He paused when he saw the group in the cell, realizing he had walked into a tense situation. Lieutenant, I need to speak with you, Stevens said quickly, glancing between Jamal and Carter. Thompson gave Carter a final hard look before stepping out of the cell and closing the door behind her. What is it, Stevens? Stevens lowered his voice, clearly trying to keep the conversation private. Mom, I've been doing some digging. Jamal West isn't just any lawyer. He's a prominent civil rights attorney. He's been involved in some big cases, the kind that make headlines. If word gets out that we arrested him without cause, it's going to be a disaster. Thompson felt her stomach drop. She had suspected there was more to this, but hearing the full scope of who Jamal was made the situation even more serious. Are you sure? Positive, Stevens replied, handing her his phone with a web page pulled up showing Jamal's profile. This is him. If we don't handle this carefully, we're going to have a lot more than just an internal investigation on our hands. Thompson quickly scanned the page, her eyes widening as she read about Jamal's background. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a powerhouse in the legal community. Someone who had taken on police departments, corporations, and government agencies. He was the kind of person who could turn this entire station upside down if they didn't tread carefully. She turned to look at Carter, who was still standing by the cell with Barnes, both of them looking increasingly uneasy. Thompson knew she had to act fast. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she couldn't afford to let it get any worse. Carter Barnes, Thompson called out, walking back toward them with a sense of urgency. We need to talk now. The two officers exchanged a glance before following Thompson out of the holding area. Once they were in a more private part of the station, Thompson rounded on them, her expression fierce. Do you have any idea who you've just arrested? She demanded, keeping her voice low but intense. Jamal West isn't just some random guy off the street. He's a civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on cases of police misconduct. If he decides to file a lawsuit against us, we're all going to be in serious trouble. Carter paled slightly, his bravado faltering. Mom, we didn't know. He didn't say anything about being a lawyer. It doesn't matter, Thompson snapped. You should have done your due diligence before bringing him in. Now we have to figure out how to handle this and fast. As she spoke, the sound of raised voices from outside the station began to filter in. Thompson's head snapped up, her heart sinking as she realized what was happening. The crowd outside was growing larger and they were getting louder. She could hear the unmistakable chants of protesters demanding justice and Jamal's release. Great, Thompson muttered under her breath. Just what we needed. Stevens, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. Lieutenant, the community is already fired up about this. We've got activists, local leaders, and even some media starting to show up. If we don't do something soon, this could turn into a full-blown crisis. Thompson knew he was right. She had seen situations like this before, small incidents that escalated into something much bigger, because they weren't handled properly. But this was different. This wasn't just about diffusing a tense situation. It was about protecting the integrity of the police force and avoiding a public relations nightmare. We need to get ahead of this, Thompson said decisively. Carter Barnes, I want you to prepare a full report on the arrest, detailing every step you took and why. I don't care how late we're here, get it done. Stevens, I need you to help me figure out the best way to handle the press. We need to control the narrative before it gets out of hand. As the officers scattered to carry out her orders, Thompson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had only been at the station for a few weeks, and already she was dealing with a potential disaster. But she wasn't about to let this ruin her career or the reputation of her department. Inside the holding cell, Jamal remained seated, his mind racing as he listened to the commotion outside. He could hear the crowd growing louder, their voices echoing through the station. He knew his family would be among them, along with the community leaders and activists who had always stood by him. They wouldn't let this go unanswered. A sense of hope flickered in his chest, but he knew it was too soon to feel relieved. The police were still in control, and they could easily manipulate the situation to their advantage. He had seen it happen before, and he wasn't about to underestimate them. Back in the front of the station, the tension continued to build. Outside, the crowd had swelled to over 100 people, with signs and banners demanding justice for Jamal. Reporters had arrived, their cameras trained on the scene, capturing every moment. The police station was becoming a flashpoint, a symbol of the growing unrest, her jaw clenched in frustration. She knew she had to do something, but she was walking a tightrope. One wrong move and everything could explode. But if she did nothing, the situation would spiral out of control on its own. She turned to Stevens, who was standing beside her, looking equally concerned. We need to release him, she said finally, her voice tight. It's the only way to de-escalate this. Stevens nodded in agreement. But how are we going to explain it to the media? They're not going to just accept that we let him go without an explanation. Thompson thought for a moment before answering. We'll frame it as a misunderstanding. Say that after reviewing the evidence, we determined there was no basis for the arrest and decided to release him. We'll emphasize that we take these matters seriously, and that we're committed to justice and fairness. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they had. With any luck, it would be enough to calm the crowd and prevent the situation from escalating further. Thompson knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had no other choice. She had to think about the bigger picture, the department, her career, and the potential fallout if they didn't handle this properly. Thompson turned away from the window and headed back to the holding area. She was determined to resolve this before it got any worse. As she walked through the station, she passed by Carter and Barnes, who were furiously typing up their reports. She paused for a moment, her gaze hardening. When this is over, we're going to have a long conversation about what went wrong here, she said coldly. And trust me, it won't be pretty. Carter swallowed hard, nodding silently. He knew he was in deep trouble. But there was nothing he could do now except hope that Thompson could fix the mess they had created. When Thompson reached Jamal's cell, she opened the door herself, stepping inside with a measured calm. "Mr. West, I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that there was a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Jamal stood slowly, his expression guarded. "A misunderstanding, Lieutenant? Is that what we're calling it?" Thompson met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Yes, I'm deeply sorry for what happened here today. It shouldn't have gone this far." Jamal studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of deceit. Finally, he nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but you should know that this isn't over." Thompson didn't doubt it for a second. She knew Jamal West was not the kind of man to let something like this slide. But for now, her priority was getting him out of the station safely and diffusing the situation outside. She escorted Jamal out of the holding area, past the tense officers who avoided his gaze. As they reached the front door, Thompson paused, taking a deep breath. "I'll do everything I can to make this right," she said quietly. Jamal nodded but didn't reply. He stepped outside, where the crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of him. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. But Jamal ignored them, walking calmly toward his waiting family and friends. As he embraced his loved ones, Thompson watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She knew this was only the beginning. Jamal West would not let this go quietly, and the ripple effects of today's events would be felt for a long time. But for now, the immediate crisis was averted. The crowd was dispersing. The reporters were packing up, and the tension that had gripped the station was beginning to ease. Thompson knew she still had a long road ahead to fix the damage done, but she was determined to face it head-on. As Jamal walked away from the station, he knew this was just the start of a new battle. He had been wronged, but he also knew how to turn that wrong into something powerful. The truth would come out, and when it did, the police department and the town would never be the same. The tension in the police station had been palpable since Jamal West walked out the front doors. Lieutenant Kate Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. As she sat in her office, reviewing the preliminary reports from Officers Carter and Barnes, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man they had arrested. Something about the way Jamal had handled himself, calm, composed, almost expectant, nagged at her. She had a gut feeling there was more to this story. Thompson wasn't one to ignore her instincts. If she had learned anything during her years on the force, it was to trust her intuition, especially when things didn't add up. Outside her office, the station buzzed with the subdued energy that followed a major incident. Officers moved about, avoiding eye contact with one another, aware that they were still walking on eggshells. The storm was far from over. The crowd outside had mostly cleared, but the damage had already been done. The uneasy quiet in the station was a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in Lieutenant Thompson's mind. She sat in her office, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled. This wasn't something that would blow over quickly. She had to dig deeper, find out who Jamal West truly was, and why his arrest had triggered such a public outcry. The integrity of the department and her own position were on the line. With a swift motion, she reached for her computer, fingers flying over the keys as she searched for anything that could shed light on the situation. What she uncovered left her reeling. Articles, news reports, interviews all painted a picture of Jamal West as a formidable civil rights attorney. He wasn't just an advocate in the courtroom. He had become a symbol of resistance, taking on corrupt institutions and winning landmark cases. His reputation alone was enough to make him a target. Thompson paused as she found more specific details. Jamal's most recent case had been a high-profile lawsuit against a police department in another city, uncovering widespread corruption. The case had resulted in several firings and criminal charges, but it had also caught the attention of law enforcement across the nation. But it didn't stop there. Thompson's heart skipped a beat as she found a chilling detail. Jamal was involved in a federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement. The investigation had led to federal oversight of multiple police departments, and rumors had begun to surface that more departments were under scrutiny. Thompson's blood ran cold. Jamal West wasn't just an attorney, he was an undercover operative, gathering evidence for a case that could bring down law enforcement officials at the highest levels, including within her own department. Her mind raced as she absorbed the implications. She immediately reached out to a trusted contact at the FBI, Someone she knew wouldn't sensationalize the information. The conversation was brief but confirmed everything she had feared. Jamal was working undercover, gathering the evidence that could bring down officers in her own department. Thompson took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This situation was far worse than she could have imagined. Jamal West had been targeted, but the officers who arrested him had unwittingly played right into his hands. If this went public, it would be a scandal of unimaginable proportions. She couldn't let her department be taken down by a mistake. She needed more information before she could take action. For the next hour, Thompson worked furiously, piecing together every bit of intel on Jamal's work, his connections, and the federal investigation. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how deep the rabbit hole went. This wasn't just a case of a wrongful arrest, it was a powder keg waiting to explode. Finally, she stood up, steeling herself for the confrontation ahead. She couldn't let her department be destroyed because of someone else's mistake. She had to fix this, no matter the cost. As she entered the officer's bullpen, she could feel the weight of the tension in the air. Carter and Barnes were hunched over their desks, scribbling reports. The moment they saw her approach, their body language stiffened. Thompson didn't waste time with pleasantries. She crossed her arms, her eyes locking onto theirs. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. Carter and Barnes exchanged a glance, their unease palpable, but they nodded and followed her into the conference room. It was a small, stark space, just a table and a few chairs. The kind of room where difficult truths were uncovered. Thompson closed the door behind them and turned to face the two officers. She didn't beat around the bush. "I know who Jamal West is," she said, her voice firm. Carter's face paled, and Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Neither said anything, but Thompson could see the panic creeping into their expressions. They hadn't realized who they were dealing with, and now they were paying the price for their ignorance. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've caused?" Thompson continued, her voice low but dangerous. "Jamal West is a civil rights attorney. He's also a federal asset." Barnes swallowed hard. "We didn't know, Lieutenant. He didn't say anything about being undercover. We thought he was just another what?" Thompson snapped, her voice rising. "Just another black man you could push around without consequences." The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment Thompson let the silence settle. The truth of what she had uncovered was sinking in, and she could see that Carter and Barnes were beginning to realize the gravity of their mistake. This wasn't just a botched arrest, it was a dangerous, catastrophic error, and the fallout would be felt far beyond their department. "We didn't know," Carter repeated, his voice shaky. "We thought he was just another guy who didn't belong in the wrong place. We never should have stopped." Thompson cut him off. "The damage is done. Now we need to fix it, and you both will be held accountable for your part in this." She left them with that, her mind already racing with the steps she needed to take to prevent the situation from escalating. The next few days would be critical. There was no way to undo the mistakes that had been made, but she could still control how the story played out. But one thing was certain, this was far from over. And Jamal West wasn't the type of man to let anything slide. Jenkins flinched, his eyes shifting nervously toward the floor. Carter opened his mouth to speak, but found himself speechless. Thompson saw the realization hit them both, the weight of their actions bearing down on them. "You two have put us all at risk," Thompson said, her voice cold as ice. "Not just the department, but the entire city. If this investigation blows up, we're all going down with it." Carter found his voice first. "Lieutenant, we didn't know. We were just following protocol." Thompson cut him off, her voice rising with frustration. "What protocol? You arrested a man without cause. You treated him like a criminal. And now we're in the middle of a federal investigation that could destroy everything we've worked for. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about the entire department." Barnes, looking pale, finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "What do we do now, Lieutenant?" Before Thompson could answer, the door to the conference room slammed open. Chief of Police Frank Daniels stormed in, his face flushed with anger. His eyes were blazing in the room escalated the moment he entered. "Lieutenant Thompson," Daniels barked, his voice booming. "What the hell is going on here?" Thompson stood tall, meeting his furious gaze. "Chief, we have a serious problem." "I know exactly who Jamal West is," Daniels snapped, cutting her off. And I know exactly what kind of mess you've made, Thompson. Thompson blinked in surprise. Chief, I save it. Daniels cut her off again, his voice sharp and venomous. Do you have any idea what kind of position you've put this department in? We've got a civil rights attorney working undercover in our city. And you just handed him all the ammunition he needs to take us down. This is a disaster and it's on you. Thompson's jaw tightened, frustration mounting. With all due respect, Chief, it's not just on me. Officers Carter and Barnes made the arrest without cause. And now we're all paying the price. Daniels shot a hard glance at Carter and Barnes. We'll deal with them later, he said flatly. Right now, we need to focus on damage control. Thompson nodded, doing her best to maintain composure. I've already started looking into the situation. There's a federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement, and it's tied to recent federal oversight of local police. Jamal West has been gathering evidence for that investigation, and if we don't handle this carefully, it could destroy us. Daniel's anger was simmering just beneath the surface, but he controlled it. What's our next move? Before Thompson could respond, there was a knock at the door. A young officer poked his head in, his face nervous. Chief, Lieutenant, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent. Daniels frowned. Who is it? The officer swallowed hard. A federal agent. His name is Williams. The room fell into a heavy silence as those words landed. Thompson exchanged a tense glance with Daniels. This was the moment they had been dreading. Send him in, Daniels ordered, his voice tight with anticipation. The officer nodded and hurried off. A moment later, the door opened and Agent Mark Williams stepped inside. He was a tall, imposing figure with an air of authority that instantly commanded attention. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, and the badge clipped to his belt gleamed under the fluorescent light. Chief Daniels, Lieutenant Thompson Williams greeted them curtly, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. We need to talk. Daniels squared his shoulders, trying to project control. Agent Williams, I'm sure we can explain. Williams raised a hand, silencing him. There's no need for explanations, Chief. I'm well aware of what's happened here. And let me be clear, this is a very serious matter. Thompson's pulse quickened. She knew from the agent's tone that whatever was coming next was going to be huge. Jamal West is a key asset in a federal investigation, Williams continued, his voice measured but stern. An investigation that has been months in the making. His arrest was a mistake. A mistake that could have far-reaching consequences if not handled properly. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. We understand that, Agent Williams. We're prepared to cooperate fully. Good, Williams replied, his tone clipped. Because right now, your cooperation is the only thing that's going to keep this situation from escalating further. Thompson's mind raced. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about Jamal West anymore. It was about everything her department, the city. And if they didn't act quickly, it could all come crashing down. Williams' gaze hardened as he addressed the room. You will provide him with a formal apology on behalf of the department. Any resistance to these orders will be met with swift and decisive action. Daniel's face flushed with anger, but he nodded stiffly. Understood. Williams turned to Thompson, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant, I expect you to oversee this personally. Make sure there are no further incidents. Thompson nodded, her mouth dry. I'll take care of it. With that, Williams gave a curt nod and turned to leave. But before he exited the room, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. And one more thing, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Consider this your warning. The federal government is watching closely. Any further misconduct within this department will not be tolerated. As the door closed behind him, the room was left in stunned silence. Thompson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, suffocating in its intensity. She knew the road ahead was going to be treacherous, but she also knew she had no choice but to navigate it. The atmosphere at the police station was heavy with tension as the day wore on. The events of the morning had set off a chain reaction that no one could have anticipated, and now everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The news of Jamal West's wrongful arrest had spread like wildfire, igniting outrage not just within the community, but across the entire city. Protests had erupted outside the station with activist community leaders and concerned citizens demanding justice. Inside, Chief Frank Daniels was trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. He knew the department was on the brink of a public relations disaster, and the only way to prevent it from spiraling out of control was to make a public apology. But he also knew that a simple apology might not be enough to quell the anger that had been brewing for years. In his office, Chief Daniels sat at his desk staring at the phone. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the receiver, dialing the number for the public relations team. He needed to prepare a statement, something that would show the community that the department was taking this seriously. But deep down, he knew that no amount of carefully crafted words could undo the damage that had been done. When the PR team answered, Daniels spoke in a low, measured tone. "I need you to draft a public apology. We're going to address the media outside the station this afternoon." "Understood, Chief. We'll prepare something immediately," the voice on the other end replied. Daniels hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The consequences of years of looking the other way when officers like Carter and Barnes crossed the line. He had always told himself that it was just part of the job, that sometimes you had to make compromises to keep the peace. But now those compromises were coming back to haunt him. A knock on the door pulled Daniels from his thoughts. Lieutenant Kate Thompson stood in the doorway, her expression tense but determined. She said, "Chief Jamal West is waiting outside with the crowd." Daniels nodded, forcing himself to stand. "Good, I'm going out there to make the apology." Thompson hesitated, then stepped forward. "Chief, I need to tell you something before you go out there." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "What is it, Thompson?" She took a deep breath. "I've uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within the department. Bribery, cover-ups, racial profiling. This goes beyond just Carter and Barnes. It's been happening for years, and it's been swept under the rug." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. "Oh, you sure?" Thompson nodded. "I've already started gathering the evidence. With Jamal's help and the federal oversight team, we can start cleaning up this mess. But it's going to be a long and difficult process." Daniels exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "Then we do what we have to do. It's time to face the consequences of our actions." Thompson gave a small nod of approval. "I'll back you up out there, Chief. We need to show the community that we're serious about change." Daniels didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said everything. He knew this wasn't just about saving face anymore. This was about survival. If they didn't act now, the entire department could be dismantled. Together, they walked out of the office and headed toward the front of the station. As they approached the doors, they could hear the sound of the crowd outside. Angry voices demanding justice, chanting for accountability. Daniels felt his stomach knot with anxiety, but he kept his expression neutral as he pushed open the doors and stepped out into the sunlight. The crowd fell silent as they saw him. Cameras clicking, microphones thrust forward. Reporters called out questions, but Daniels ignored them, focusing on the podium that had been set up for the press conference. You could see Jamal standing among the crowd, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding attention. Daniels cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it slightly. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting, judging. The tension was palpable. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I want to start by acknowledging the events that took place earlier today. The arrest of Mr. Jamal West was a mistake, one that should never have happened. I take full responsibility for what occurred, and I want to offer my sincerest apologies to Mr. West and to the community." The crowd murmured, a mixture of skepticism and anger rippling through the air. Daniels could feel the weight of decades of mistrust bearing down on him. "We recognize that this incident is part of a larger problem," Daniels continued, his tone somber. "A problem that has persisted for far too long within our department. I want to assure you all that we are committed to addressing these issues head-on. Effective immediately, Officers Carter and Barnes have been suspended pending an internal investigation. We will be conducting a thorough review of our practices and procedures, and we will work closely with federal oversight to ensure that we are holding ourselves to the highest standards of accountability." The crowd grew quiet, listening intently, but Daniels could still see the doubt in their eyes, the weariness that came from years of broken promises. "I know that words alone are not enough," Daniels said, his voice faltering slightly. "We have a lot of work to do to rebuild the trust that has been lost. But I want you to know that we are committed to making the necessary changes. We will work with community leaders, activists, and organizations to create a department that serves and protects everyone, regardless of race or background. He paused, trying to find the right words to conclude. But before he could continue, Jamal West stepped forward, raising a hand to stop him. "Chief Daniels," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about words. This is about action. True justice goes beyond a public apology. It requires real change, real accountability, and real commitment." Daniels nodded slowly, stepping back from the microphone. He knew that Jamal was right, an apology was only the beginning, and the real work was still ahead of them. Jamal turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding their full attention. "We've heard apologies before," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "but what we need now is a commitment to real, lasting change. We need to hold those in power accountable for their actions, and we need to work together to create a system that treats everyone with fairness and dignity." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in agreement. Jamal's words resonated with them, cutting through the anger and frustration that had been building for so long. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Jamal continued, his voice strong and clear. "This is about all of us. It's about every person who has been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through, and it's about ensuring that justice is not just a word, but a reality." The crowd cheered, and Jamal paused, letting the energy of the moment wash over him. You could see the hope in their eyes, the desire for something better. It was a powerful feeling, one that he knew he couldn't ignore. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Jamal said, his tone more measured now. "It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes all of us working together, but I believe that we can make it happen. I believe that we can build a better future, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will come after us." As the applause swelled, Jamal stepped back from the podium, his message delivered. The crowd's response was overwhelming, a surge of support that filled him with determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but he was ready for it. He was ready to lead the fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that the voices of the marginalized were heard. As Jamal made his way through the crowd, embracing friends and supporters, Lieutenant Thompson watched from the steps of the station. She felt a mixture of relief and resolve, relief that the immediate crisis had been averted, and resolve to see the changes through. She knew the department had a long road ahead, but with people like Jamal West leading the charge, she believed they could make it. Thompson turned to Chief Daniels, who was still standing by the podium, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We have a lot of work to do," she said quietly. Daniels nodded, his eyes fixed on the crowd. Daniels cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it slightly. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, judging him, waiting to see what he would say. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I want to start by acknowledging the events that took place earlier today. The arrest of Mr. Jamal West was a mistake, one that should never have happened. I take full responsibility for what occurred, and I want to offer my sincerest apologies to Mr. West and to the community." The crowd murmured, a mixture of skepticism and anger rippling through the air. Daniels could feel the pressure building, the weight of decades of mistrust bearing down on him. "We recognize that this incident is part of a larger problem," Daniels continued, his tone somber. "A problem that has persisted for far too long within our department. I want to assure you all that we are committed to addressing these issues head-on. Effective immediately, Officers Carter and Barnes have been suspended pending an internal investigation. We will be conducting a thorough review of our practices and procedures, and we will work closely with federal oversight to ensure that we are holding ourselves to the highest standards of accountability." The crowd was quiet now, listening intently, but Daniels could see the doubt in their eyes, the weariness that came from years of broken promises. "I know that words alone are not enough," Daniels said, his voice faltering slightly. "We have a lot of work to do to rebuild the trust that has been lost, but I want you to know that we are committed to making the necessary changes. We will work with community leaders, activists, and organizations to create a department that serves and protects everyone, regardless of race or background." He paused, searching for the right words to end his statement, but before he could continue, Jamal West stepped forward, raising a hand to stop him. "Chief Daniels," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm, "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about words. This is about action. True justice goes beyond a public apology. It requires real change, real accountability, and real commitment." Daniels nodded slowly, stepping back from the microphone. He knew that Jamal was right, an apology was just the beginning, and the real work was still ahead of them. Jamal turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding their full attention. "We've heard apologies before," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But what we need now is a commitment to real, lasting change. We need to hold those in power accountable for their actions, and we need to work together to create a system that treats everyone with fairness and dignity." The crowd erupted in applause, voices rising in agreement. Jamal's words resonated with them, cutting through the anger and frustration that had been building for so long. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Jamal continued, his voice strong and clear. "This is about all of us. It's about every person who has been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. And it's about ensuring that justice is not just a word, but a reality." The crowd cheered, and Jamal paused, letting the energy of the moment wash over him. He could see the hope in their eyes, the desire for something better. It was a powerful feeling, one that he knew he couldn't ignore. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Jamal said, his tone more measured now. "It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes all of us working together, but I believe that we can make it happen. I believe that we can build a better future, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will come after us." As the applause swelled, Jamal stepped back from the podium, his message delivered. The crowd's response was overwhelming, a surge of support that filled him with determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but he was ready for it. He was ready to lead the fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that the voices of the marginalized were heard. As Jamal made his way through the crowd, embracing friends and supporters, Lieutenant Thompson watched from the steps of the station. She felt a mixture of relief and resolve, relief that the immediate crisis had been averted, and resolve to see the changes through. She knew that the department had a long road ahead, but with people like Jamal West leading the charge, she believed they could make it. Thompson turned to Chief Daniels, who was still standing by the podium, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We have a lot of work to do," she said quietly. Daniels nodded, his eyes fixed on the crowd. As the crowd began to disperse, Thompson noticed a figure lingering at the edge of the gathering. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit with an air of quiet authority. He watched Jamal with an intense gaze, his expression unreadable. Curious, Thompson made her way over to the man. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man turned to her, his eyes sharp and focused. "I'm here to speak with Mr. West," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I have a message for him." Thompson frowned, studying the man more closely. There was something about him that put her on edge, something she couldn't quite place. "Who are you?" The man smiled slightly, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "You're someone who has a vested interest in seeing justice done." Before Thompson could respond, the man turned and walked toward Jamal, disappearing into the crowd. She watched him go, a sense of unease settling in her gut. Whoever he was, she had a feeling this wasn't the last time they would see him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the station steps, Thompson knew that the events of the day were just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could finally start to make things right. Across the city, in a small community center, another important meeting was taking place. Jamal sat at a table surrounded by a diverse group of individuals, community leaders, activists, legal experts, and concerned citizens. They were hammering out the details of the Community Justice Initiative, debating strategies and priorities. "We need to focus on education," argued Maria Hernandez, a local school teacher. "If we want lasting change, we have to start with the youth." "I agree," said Dr. James Carter, a sociology professor at the City University. "But we can't ignore the immediate needs of those currently suffering under an unjust system. We need a multi-pronged approach." Jamal listened carefully to each perspective, taking notes and asking questions. He was impressed by the passion and expertise in the room. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a collaborative effort that drew on the strengths of the entire community. As the meeting progressed, they began to form concrete plans. They would establish a legal aid clinic to provide free representation to those who couldn't afford it. They would develop a community oversight board to work alongside the police department's internal affairs division. They would create educational programs for schools and community centers focusing on civil rights, civic engagement, and conflict resolution. By the time the meeting adjourned, everyone felt energized and focused. They had a long road ahead, but they had taken the first steps together. As the weeks turned into months, the city began to see small but significant changes. The police department, under the watchful eye of Lieutenant Thompson and the newly established Oversight Board, implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Officers like Carter, who had shown a genuine desire to improve, were given opportunities to work directly with community leaders and social workers. The Community Justice Initiative, meanwhile, had hit the ground running. Their legal aid clinic had already taken on dozens of cases, providing representation to individuals who had been wrongfully arrested or subjected to police misconduct. The educational programs were being piloted in several schools, with plans to expand citywide. But perhaps the most significant change was in the atmosphere of the city itself. There was a sense of engagement of people coming together to address long-standing issues. Neighborhood watch groups were collaborating with police officers to improve safety without resorting to racial profiling. Community forums were being held regularly, providing a platform for open dialogue between citizens and local officials. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still incidents of misconduct, still moments of tension and mistrust. Change was a slow process, and there were those who resisted it at every turn. But the difference now was that there were systems in place to address these issues, to hold people accountable, and to keep pushing forward. 6 months after the incident that had sparked it all, Jamal found himself back at the police station. This time, however, he wasn't there as a suspect or a victim, but as a partner. He had been invited to speak at a training session for new recruits to share his perspective and help shape the next generation of officers. As he walked through the halls, Jamal couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The atmosphere in the station was different. It was quieter, more hopeful. Officers were engaged in conversations with community leaders, and the walls seemed less intimidating. There was a sense of purpose now, a feeling that things were finally moving in the right direction.